Well, thank you. I'm Tom Rogers. I'm really honored to be here today. I spent much of my adult life as a submarine officer. As a commanding officer of a submarine, I was directly responsible for nuclear weapons. I understand their terrible destructive power. If I fail to oppose a strategy based on nuclear annihilation, then I'm complicit. So, I've spent the last 20 years opposing nuclear weapons here at Ground Zero Center, but simply opposing my country's national security strategy isn't enough. We need to articulate a path and a plan for the total elimination of nuclear weapons. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to refer to specific numbers of warheads and launchers, and those numbers come from the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist Nuclear Notebook. It's freely available online, and it's the definitive source for this material. As you can see, there are over 12,700 nuclear warheads in the world today, and the US and Russia account for most of them. The first column of the table, deployed warheads, there are warheads that are mated to either ballistic missiles or are stored close to dedicated bomber aircraft. For the most part, they're essentially ready to launch right now, anytime. For the US, that number includes 944 ballistic missiles on Trident submarines, 400 intercontinental ballistic missiles in silos in the upper Midwest, 300 at 2 bomber bases in the Midwest, and 100 deployed warheads in Europe. Those are tactical bombs in Europe. The numbers listed on here for France, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea are estimates because those countries have not disclosed their stockpiles. In 1986, prior to the end of the Cold War, there were over 70,000 warheads in the world. And obviously that's come down a lot. The problem is since 2010, it's leveled off. There's been almost no reductions. So it's time to renew our efforts and the world's efforts to dismantle warheads. So with this, we call on our government to aggressively reduce our nuclear weapons stockpiles with a goal of complete nuclear weapons elimination. This is really a simple process, and I'm going to break it down for you. First, we'll call on the US and Russia to dismantle non-deployed warheads. The majority of nuclear warheads in both the US and Russia's stockpiles are not deployed. That generally means the warheads are stored, separate from launchers, not available for use on short notice. That number also includes retired, obsolete, but intact warheads that are maintained in storage bunkers waiting to be dismantled for years and years and years and years. It's like it's hard to throw away a perfectly good warhead. So, as you can see here, the US and Russia have over 8,000 warheads that aren't deployed. With national security strategies that are generally based on strategic deterrence, reduction of non-deployed weapons can be accomplished without affecting those national security strategies at all. Breaking down the non-deployed warheads, the US and Russia each have over 1,500 retired warheads in storage. U.S. warheads are mostly intact assemblies that are stored under Department of Energy control near Albuquerque. Retired warheads for us are low-hanging fruit. They can be dismantled unilaterally, dramatically reducing the U.S. stockpile by nearly 40%, with no change in our government's national security strategy. Russia has a comparable number, could do the same. So to reduce inventories, both nations should resume dismantling warheads just as they dismantled warheads between 1990 and 2010. This can be done unilaterally or bilaterally, has no effect on readiness, but demonstrates intent. Moving to the next two columns, strategic reserve and tactical, note that the U.S. has a larger strategic reserve, Russia has more tactical warheads. That's going to require negotiation to phase in that dismantling effort bilaterally with Russia. And that's where phase two comes in, and that's the START treaty. Now is the time to renegotiate New START, and we should recognize that war in Ukraine complicates any bilateral negotiations with Russia. But it's vital that they move forward, and we call on the Biden State Department to do this now and not pass this important work to the next administration. We should demand that the new treaty provide for a transition to minimum deterrence that results in a level playing field with Russia, China, and the other 6 nuclear weapon states. And this new reduction will form a basis for future negotiations for total elimination of nuclear weapons. The next version of New START must also reduce the number of deployed warheads and their launchers. And the treaty must apply to non-deployed warheads as well. So I'll first address minimum deterrence. That's a new term that I've introduced, and I'll talk to that in a few slides. First, let's just explain what New START is. It's the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, and the key word here is reduction. When New START was ratified back in 2010, most of us in the nuclear weapons movement thought that it was going to be a transition to reductions. And it didn't turn out that way. What it turned out is Congress forced the modernization of the entire nuclear weapons arsenal at the level, maximum level allowed by New START, and everything that they have done points to maintaining that level forever. Last year, the U.S. came perilously close to allowing New START to expire. New START was scheduled to expire on February 5th, 2021. The Trump administration opposed extending the existing treaty and failed to negotiate a new treaty. So on January 20th, when the Biden administration came in, they rapidly approached the Russians and said, we need to extend this treaty. And they were able to pull it off and extended the treaty on February 3rd, 2 days before it expired. And we really have to commend the Biden administration for jumping in and doing that. That was a big deal. Nobody heard about it, but it was a big deal. Because without New START, inspections and notifications conducted by both sides to enforce the treaty would have ceased. New START includes intrusive on-site inspections, open skies agreements, and extensive notifications of tests and weapons movements that raise confidence. It provides a reciprocal window into both sides' nuclear weapons programs. That all would have gone away. The other thing that would have gone away is the limit on deployed nuclear weapons. We'll talk some more about that in a minute. But first, what's a minimum deterrent? I introduced this as a transitional level that the US and Russia need to achieve before the final phase of reductions can begin. And it's about the concept. The specific numbers aren't not that important. I pulled 500 out of somewhere. But there have been a lot of studies that indicate, both government and non-governmental studies that indicate 500 to 1,000 is a good minimum deterrent that will prevent a war. Minimum deterrence requires a no first use policy. You don't have enough weapons to do first use and second strike with a minimum deterrent. It's essentially retaliatory. India and China have both adopted minimum credible deterrent strategies for years, although some analysts right now are saying that China is moving away from no first use and are building up. And that's something that we have to stem with negotiations. Minimum deterrence is incompatible with counterforce strategies. A counterforce strategy is when one side uses their nuclear weapons to destroy the other side's nuclear weapons. So the Russians can't afford to put 400 nuclear warheads into North Dakota, Wyoming, and Montana to destroy the US ICBMs. It's incompatible with minimum deterrence. The other thing is it most likely won't support multilateral security commitments, which we've got a bunch of. We provide security commitments for all of NATO and Pacific allies, South Korea, Australia, and somebody else. Who? Japan, thank you. There's a second benefit to that is that provides a motivation for NATO states and the Pacific states to join the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Without our nuclear umbrella, that's the next logical step for all of those nations. So how do you achieve a minimum deterrent? Now, there's lots of formulas for reducing deployed weapons. In my mind, the ICBMs are the most vulnerable to a counterattack or a counterforce first strike, so there's great urgency to use them. ICBMs suffer from the use them or lose them syndrome. So as soon as they detect something that might be a launch, they're starting the countdown, and they've done it many, many, many times. They're dangerous. Get rid of them. So what do? Decommission all 400 ICBM silos. The Air Force, of course, disagrees with that. But the idea is that the minimum deterrent is transitional to total elimination. The other thing about going to a minimum deterrent is it should be apparent that new replacement strategic weapons systems funding must be terminated. No Columbia class. no ground-based strategic deterrent, no B-21 bomber. Now, the amount of money that would be saved is left as an exercise for the students. Hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars going into those replacement systems that could be gotten rid of. As you know, New START doesn't apply to non-deployed warheads. So the next iteration of New START must apply to those weapons. If this treaty had been allowed to expire in 2021, the United States was positioned to double its deployed warheads in a matter of weeks. Right now, there are over 1,000 W-76 warheads divided between Bangor and Kings Bay. There's probably 600 or 700 of those warheads sitting right now in a bunker 1.4 miles from here. Those warheads could be uploaded to the ballistic missile submarines in a matter of weeks. Each missile can accommodate 8 warheads. Today, each missile is carrying 4 to 5, and that's to comply with the limits of New START. Without New START, you upload to 8 warheads per missile. Similarly, there are 400 W-78 warheads stored at Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming. And the newest variant of the Minuteman III currently has 1 warhead on it. It can accommodate 3. Those 400 extra warheads could go on the 200 Minuteman III missiles in a matter of weeks. And similarly, there's several hundred bomber weapons that could be deployed as well. So just like that, the treaty goes away, all the deployed weapons, or all the non-deployed weapons get deployed. That's really dangerous. Not just, okay, we still have the treaty. But what's it take to cancel a treaty? It takes somebody getting scared and nervous. So we need to get rid of those deployed weapons. And that's part of what the transition to a minimum deterrent is about. There does need to be some reserve weapons. I propose limiting the reserve warheads to 150. That level allows for just normal maintenance and rotation of submarines and weapons for maintenance, availabilities, and that. So what you come up with is a total of 650 warheads for the US and Russia, and about 1,300 for the rest of the world. And that's what it looks like. This is going to take years. Recognize that. But it's a transitional goal. And what's left in the US stockpile at a minimum deterrent? Again, this is just one formula. The Air Force would retain ICBMs as part of the balance and would force decommissioning more of the submarines. But that gets you there. And voila, if you add up all those warheads, it's 472 deployed warheads and 144 reserve warheads. There's more to New START than just warheads. we must address inspection and verification protocols. It's vital that the pits, the third bullet there, it's vital that the pits are destroyed to prevent their use in rearming. If you've got a plutonium pit, you can build a bomb. Currently, there are over 15,000 pits stored at the Pantex site in Amarillo, Texas. There's a pit conversion facility that's just getting started in Savannah River, South Carolina, that will convert the plutonium pits to a mixed oxide fuel for use in commercial nuclear reactors, destroying that fissile material and making it so it can't ever be used to build another bomb. That program needs to go forward. At the same time, the Department of Energy is currently funded from the last administration to build new pits. We should call on the U.S. to terminate new pit production, renounce new weapons development, and then finally call on the Biden administration to enter into similar bilateral negotiations with China to stem its plans for nuclear weapons expansion during the period that the U.S. and Russia are reducing. Final phase. Decommissioning and dismantling warheads and launchers under New START would lower the U.S. and Russia stockpiles to 650. And during this process, the total stockpiles of the other 7 would still be around 1,300. This is a manageable number to begin multilateral negotiations under Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Article 6 requires that all the nuclear weapon states negotiate in good faith to bring on total disarmament. Now, the Non-Proliferation Treaty is 52 years old. It's been around since 1970. It's still the holy grail of nuclear weapons treaties. There was a NPT review conference last August that ended without consensus on a final statement, and that was basically because of the Ukraine war. It was a totally political review, and the U.S. and Russian delegations just went at one another. I'm still convinced, more than ever, though, that renegotiating New START is the key to leveling the playing field and then opening up meaningful negotiations under Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. That's the path. And then finally, we've got the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. But until the 9 nuclear weapon states agree to disarm, all 9 of them, the TPNW will not be complete. That doesn't diminish its importance. I think once multilateral negotiations occur under Article 6, then the NPT, or the TPNW, will emerge as the final unifying document at the end of the nuclear age. The most important thing is verification. Verification is key to nuclear disarmament, and we know that cooperative verification works. The U.S. and Russia have conducted hundreds of intrusive inspections, thousands of notifications to verify their programs. Similar inspections under the control of the United Nations can and will ensure compliance. Voila, it's that simple. Imagine. Thank you. Thank you very much. Any questions? I'm really open to questions and discussion. Doug?
I once read that the United States nuclear target strategy directed at the Soviet Union included multiple nuclear weapons going to their major command control section, the Chekhov command control thing in the Soviet Union. So I assume that with the total number of weapons that are there, that because of the density of nuclear weapons at this base and then the Jim Creek trigger thing as well, that there are a number of redundant weapons being targeted here. Any idea of what kind of megatonnage is pointed into western Washington where we all live?
I don't have that crystal ball, Doug, but I mean, you have to believe that this is a major target, and this is where coming down into a no first use minimum deterrent strategy prevents a counterforce, because this is really that we're a counterforce target. The value of the Trident fleet is it'll take 3 days and every submarine's at sea. So as the DEFCON rises, as tensions rise, the waterfront at Bangor is going to be pretty lonely. Everybody's going to go to sea. And we've seen demonstrations recently. A submarine actually did a crew change at sea just to demonstrate they could do it. Somebody told me that shortly after the beginning of the Ukraine war, every submarine in Bangor was at sea. And that was maybe a month or two later when they did the crew change of guys that had been at sea since before the war, and they took them all out in a boat and transferred them and had a new crew without the ship ever going into port. So if the non-deployed, if the reserve warheads were not here, this wouldn't be much of a target. There's those 600 or 700 warheads that are in the bunker right across the fence. They're a big target. They're a counterforce target. But the deployed weapons on the submarines, they're all at sea. So who cares? And that's the thing. Same thing with the ICBMs. If there are no ICBMs, then there's no reason to target the ICBMs. Similar from the other side. I mean, the Russians have the same strategy issues. So there's so many warheads and so many targets that have gone away. Back in the day, they would have put 100 warheads on Bangor. Next. Yes, sir.
Is it under the START treaty, does that mean that Russian inspectors have come here to look at
Yes.
the
Yes.
situation?
Yes. And regretfully, during the pandemic, the on-site inspections were suspended. And now that the pandemic has cooled down and there's a lot of tension, neither the US or Russia are granting visas for the inspectors to enter their respective countries. It's ridiculous, but that's what's going on right now. But I'm told very recently there was an article in a Russian paper, if you can believe it, or not a paper, but a blog or something, that back-channel negotiations were going on to resume the on-site inspections. So there's stuff going on. Sir?
So how many, across the United States, how many organizations are there like Ground Zero?
I don't know the answer to that. I know I just read a really good book about opposition to the ground-based strategic deterrent at Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota. And an organization there that's of grassroots, a few people getting together and saying this is really dumb. And there is an organization located near Kings Bay, Georgia, that looks a lot like Ground Zero. There is the Washington Physicians for Social Responsibility Nuclear Weapons Task Force, and they're nationwide, but they have a big task force here and another one on the East Coast. And then as ICANN, which is the International Coalition Against Nuclear Weapons, and that's the organization that pulls together 60 some odd other organizations, and we have 1/60th of their Nobel Peace Prize from a couple of years ago. ICANN got the Nobel Peace Prize, but ICANN is just an organization that pulls together a whole bunch of other organizations. It was ICANN that managed to push the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons through the United Nations. Yes, ma'am.
Where does advocacy make the most difference, with the U.S. Congress, and how is that happening with ICANN network, or with the UN, or both? And is it happening right now, this kind of advocacy, this kind of point-by-point plan?
There are other plans that look similar. Global Zero has a phased plan. The advocacy, I was just invited to take this presentation to both senators and a couple of congressmen right after the midterms through WPSR, Washington Physicians for Social Responsibility, that has bucks and does a lot of lobbying. And so they have a lot more access to government than we do. Again, we're just some grassroots folks that do demonstrations locally, trying to raise local awareness of what's going on, just because this is where the bombs are. I didn't really answer the question as well as you'd like me to, but that's the best I can do right now. Elizabeth.
I know that militaries are always interested in a test bed for their new weapons, and I'm wondering, just as a former Navy, a senior Navy person, what is the likelihood that the Navy will want to deploy its new low-yield nuclear weapons in some form, taking advantage of the current tensions? What's your sense?
It scares the shit out of me, because it's so irrational. Yet, that's what they were built for, to lower the threshold for use. And it's a great, if the Russians decide to use a tactical nuclear weapon in Europe, that is the excuse to use those low-yield nuclear weapons. And let me tell you, there is no such thing as a low-yield nuclear weapon. The low-yield nuclear weapons, the W-76-2 that are on the Tridents, and there's 1 or 2 on each ship, is about 8 kilotons, 8,000 tons of TNT, about half the size of the Hiroshima bomb. They're city busters. And they have all of the bad stuff associated with nuclear weapons. One of the things about nuclear weapons, of course, is the radiation and contamination fallout. That comes from the atomic part of the bomb. Okay, a thermonuclear weapon can run up to maybe 50 kilotons, and that's about the max. And the rest of it is the fusion part of the bomb, makes it a thermonuclear weapon. And so when a thermonuclear weapon detonates, you're detonating a 15 kiloton pit and causing a fusion reaction that is really destructive, but doesn't have the nasty stuff. You know, so what I'm trying to convey is a small nuclear weapon is just an atomic bomb, and a big nuclear, thermonuclear weapon doesn't have that much more long-lasting radiation and contamination effect. Low-yield nuclear weapons are just as nasty as thermonuclear bombs if you're 10 miles away. See what I mean? Okay. Yes?
Another question because of Kevin's this. What would the possibilities, what is the fear of the United States, I wonder, about unilateral disarmament? So that, is the fear that somehow it would be made powerful and Russia would come and take over the country? I don't know what the fear is exactly with unilateral disarmament. What will happen? Will we?
Well, that is fear. I mean, and, you know, if you look at it from an adversarial standpoint, the Russians believe if they disarm, we will attack them. And our government believes that if we disarm, the Russians will attack us. And that's the way it's been since 1950. And we have to build trust in order to bilaterally disarm. And until the things we can do unilaterally are get rid of the obsolete weapons, the obsolete warheads, and then reduce the numbers of reserve warheads. If you shoot your deployed warheads, it's not like you're going to come back for a reload. It's all fear. And who's fomenting that fear? It's the arms industry. That you know, the trillions of dollars that have gone into nuclear weapons have made a lot of people rich, and they don't want to give that up. And they own the media. Doug.
This isn't a question, following up what you just said, I recognize that part of the virtue of having NATO expand past the limits that were set by our governments when Russia disappeared. The NATO expansion has been an enormous sales of weaponry.
Yep.
And the greatest threat to life is the military-industrial, congressional think tanks, groups, the people that focus all this stuff into existence. And they have an agenda that is risking all of our lives on this war in the Ukraine. And our lives are as captive as the Russians are.
Don't get me started on election finance reform, okay? Because that's what it's really, the root of it. When you have to be a millionaire to run for Congress, well, nobody's a millionaire running for Congress. They've got all the money from all of the lobbies, and every one of them has sold their soul before they get there. There are no souls left in Washington. I spoke with Rick Larson some years ago about the stuff. And he said, the moral argument doesn't fly in Washington. It's all about the money. And then he went and voted for the NDAA. I said, our grandchildren are going to be paying for the Columbia class. And he was like this, and he went, yes, you're right. And then he went and voted for it. But we have hope. We have hope. I do. In my lifetime, I have hope. Thank you. Thank you very much.
For you as a officer, did you have the ability to say no, sir, if the instructions to launch war, launch those weapons did occur? Do you think that there are those that would say no that are currently in office?
Here's what I think I know. What I think I know is every commanding officer of a Trident submarine takes an extra oath before he becomes a commanding officer of that submarine. Above and beyond the oaths that every officer takes and every congressman, you remember that oath. I used to know it by heart. But those guys, the Trident COs, take an extra one. And they say in that oath, and if I'm ordered to shoot these weapons, I will. And it's crazy to believe they won't. It's crazy to hope they won't. That's not the way war will be prevented. Hi, Kathy.
So how do we sell this program? I mean, how do we get anybody, like, do we say, is it because of or what are the incentives, for the U.S. and Russia to reduce, just like, to save money or to, of course it reduces the number of weapons, but I mean, what's in it for them, kind of?
It is economics. The trillions of dollars going into these programs are accomplish nothing.
Yeah.
Except make rich people richer. So to me, that's the incentive. It's economic, but it's also reducing risk. Oh gosh, there was a quote that came out of the NPT review from Austria, and I want to try to get it right. What the Austrians said, and they're the only European nation that has signed the only NATO nation that has signed the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and they said that there is no cure for nuclear war; it must be prevented. And I didn't get it quite right, but that was the gist of it. Charlie.
So you mentioned this oath that the nuclear sub, Trident sub captains have to take. Ground Zero's put out into the newspaper the advertisement that say brothers and sisters, and as I recall, it says, it's illegal to use nuclear weapons, so don't do it. So how does that comport with the oath that the captains did?
The captains will agree that an order to launch nuclear weapons is a lawful order because it would only come to allow the survival of the nation, either as a second strike or, I'll just say, as a second strike. It's hard to think. It is so hard to think. But when I think that, oh no, Tridents wouldn't do a first strike, but the answer is, of course they would do a first strike. That was their bill to do, a first strike counterforce strike. That's what the Trident 2 D5 life extension program that improved the targeting and the triggers. Some admiral bragged that we used to be able to put those weapons into an area the size of Yankee Stadium, and now we can hit home plate. And that's what you need to be able to do to counter an ICBM or a mobile missile. You've got to be able to hit it or be very close to it. And that's what we can do with the current technology. So, gosh, it's all about fear, and it's all about survival. And if you take away those horrible, horrible weapons, then you get to survive. I'm a logical guy. We're all logical people, and it makes perfect sense to us. So why can't the rest of the government, why can't the government see that? And many do, but they're slaves. Yes, sir. Were you scratching your head, or do you have a question?
I have a question. What made the government heads?
What made the government
Yeah.
heads? Well, that's a great question, because back, I think, 240 years ago, there was a bunch of guys that wanted freedom. And they made the United States of America, and they wrote the Constitution, and it gave us all this freedom. And then a few people got really, really, really rich. And then they got really, really, really powerful. And without taking over the government, they bought the government. They bought the government, and now they use the government to become more rich and more powerful. And we've got to stop that somehow. And we need to do it peacefully. We need to vote. We need to get the right people elected. We need to, the old people, the really old people that are running the world right now need to be replaced by people who grew up after all these horrible wars. People who are 50 now. I know that's really old. But those are the people that are going to fix it. Not me, not your grandpa. It's the younger generation, the generation of your mom and dad that are going to fix it.
I have a question.
Terry?
Just how easy would it be for, I grew up believing that it was pretty hard for anyone to decide to use a nuclear weapon, that there were all these checks and balances and all these different people involved. And then the older I get, the more I start to hear that it's really not that complicated. It's more like, you know, how easy would it be, not by accident, because that's different, but on purpose? Who can actually tell somebody, and how does it actually happen?
That's a great question, and I got asked this question. In fact, Elizabeth and I, during the Trump administration, hey Elizabeth, remember when we went down to Port Orchard for the, was it Kiwanis or some club? We went to this breakfast
the
meeting.
Rotary Club actually invited us, and that was right
It was
after
Rotary.
an editorial that made it into the Seattle Times about Ground Zero being part of ICANN and how
Yeah.
the treaty on it. But yeah, it was a wonderful presentation.
But what it was about was, can Trump start a nuclear war? And the answer was yes. And if a president, using the nuclear codes, orders a nuclear strike, that order goes directly from wherever the president is in the world to a place in the Pentagon called the National Military Command Center. And there's always either a general or an admiral on there, 24/7, with a small staff, and he gets this message from the president, authenticates it, and it's sent directly to the ICBM silos and the submarines and the bomber bases, with nothing in between.
That's just like
and-
Dr. Strangelove.
Well, yeah, it is, it is. But here's a wrinkle. Toward the end of the Trump administration, General Milley, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, inserted himself, illegally, inserted himself in that chain of command. He got every one of the National Military Command Center watch officers in a room and said, none of you are going to send that order unless you talk to me first. And he went around the table and made each one of those generals and admirals agree that they would not transmit an order to use nuclear weapons until General Milley said it was okay.
And President Trump.
Well, yeah. and you also have to know that there's all kinds of contingency plans. Okay, so when the terrorist blows up the White House and kills the president and the vice president, and we don't know about Congress, who can then become that person? And those contingency plans exist. You have to know they exist, but I don't know the answers. I mean, they're closely held. But yes, there are people further down who could do that, but that would be only, after the whole the leadership, upper leadership is dead.
And do we know anything about, I mean, to a certain degree, it sounds like there is some protection on the US side, maybe, that it wouldn't get to an actual detonation just by one person deciding, although it sounds like it still could.
No, it does. It does.
Yeah.
There's nothing to stop it. I don't think General Milley's in the chain of command anymore.
Yeah.
When Biden came in, things went back to normal, and there's no reason to believe it's any different in the Russian Federation. One person can start a nuclear war. And that's, wow. Thank you. Thank you very much. This has been really fun.